Yes, we can.
Yeah.
If there's any issues with accessibility, or if you can't, if you would like to put the live transcription on, definitely recommend that. And the most important thing is if there's any issues throughout the session, then just put it in the chat and either Katrina or I will deal with it as we're going. Welcome to the second session in the Twilight Zone Research Support series. For those of you that are online, you probably can't see it. We have some people in the room, so I am going to be talking to them. And I will try and talk to the camera over there. And we've also got a roaming cam just here. So you should be able to see a couple of different images.
Pass that to me while you're doing that.
I made it.
Oh, all right, sorry.
It's you've got enough to do. So the idea of this series is really to provide additional materials and sessions which are designed to bolster and support qualitative researchers. So not all of you here today will be conducting qualitative research. I'm sure some of you have joined us online. I'm sure some of you have done lots of different types of research, but the reason why we are running this is we are qualitative researchers. We do exclusively qualitative research. And so the training programs that we've put on, and you can see we've got another 2 coming up, one more this month, another next month, are designed to try and support and better support researchers in whatever projects that they're doing. So today we're focusing on the actual writing of a thesis, and I'm sure some of you are either master's students, some of you might be PhD students, DBA students. We've also got some supervisors, or you might be thinking about supervising some students in the future, or you're doing so now. This session is designed really to take you through what is expected from a qualitative thesis. And I guess the big caveat with that is there are lots of variations within that. So it's very much an umbrella, but there are some common themes and common expectations, and that's what we want to take you through today. In terms of the Breaking Binaries project, Katrina and I founded this research program really to address what we feel is a much needed gap. And this is around exploring what we call complex and diverse identities at work. So that kind of brackets what we do. We focus at work, and work is such a broad term. It focuses on sorts of different types of work. And we're really interested in exploring how individuals experience work, how individuals are shaped by and within work. And we've got a number of different projects that we're running within the programme. Funded by the CIPD at the moment, and also funded by the Institute of Small Business and Entrepreneurship, as well as a couple of other internally funded projects that we're doing. All of them fit within this idea that we want to challenge categorical binaries that we are so used to using, particularly around gender, for example, particularly around even within gender, within sexuality. You think about how we label ourselves and we categorize ourselves. Our view is that we are trying to progress understandings, and particularly in relation to work, how that impacts individuals in the context of work. So the clues in the name, Breaking Binaries, that is pretty much what we aim to do, and we are seeking to do more research within that. And we have a fantastic group of doctoral researchers who are doing some fantastic work, both within the kind of scope of the project and also beyond the scope of the project as well. But there's common themes within all of them. And so our goal really is to grow a research and evidence base to support this idea that diversity is more than just putting people through diversity training. That is really it in terms of the Breaking Binaries project and what we do. And the Twilight Zone series really focuses on the methodology and the research methods side. And that's another passion project. I'd say Katrina is definitely I'm thinking of a polite term to use. With it, a force, I would say, a force when it comes to qualitative methodology, and really ensuring that qualitative research is of high quality, and producing work which demonstrates that it's not just about going and doing some interviews, which I think is a common assumption. It's much more than that. and that there's training required, there's skills required to do really great qualitative research, and also that it's not just about text, it goes beyond that. There are all sorts of different modes of what counts as data. And that's something which I think Katrina's been a real force of nature in pushing. I like that term. I'm going to use that more often in pushing. And it's something that she inspired me to do in my PhD. Katrina was my supervisor. So my view is that I want to continue and build that with Katrina moving forward. And hopefully you guys will all take something from this today too. So today, and some of you might be, is this you? Me? Oh, sorry. This is Katrina. So the system is when there's a pink title,
it's me.
That's Katrina. And when there's an orange title, that's me. And that is what gets you to be a professor.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the fabulous introduction, Helen. So we are we call this a walkthrough. We are going to focus on our own PhD thesis quite a lot of the time, but then also broaden that out and to discuss some top tips and general pointers for success in terms of qualitative thesis. We're going to start off with a little exercise in a minute and some general points about a thesis. We're going to give you a brief, not the full 100,000 word version, overview of each of our theses, just so you get a sense of where we were at the time that we completed those. We'll then have a short break, and then we will do pretty much, it's not a chapter by chapter walkthrough, but it is a chunk by chunk walkthrough, talk about what we did, why we did it, which is probably the most important bit. And we've left quite a bit of time at the end, hopefully, for questions. So what we wanted to get you to do is something that we've sort of done informally quite a lot, is to just write down the first 3 things that come to your head when you think about any old qualitative thesis, and you can insert there the level at which you're studying. So this could be a qualitative PhD thesis or a qualitative DBA thesis, or a qualitative MSc thesis. Don't think too hard about it. Just write down the first 3 things that come into your head. Then, having done that, now write down the first 3 things that come into your head when you think about your own thesis or your journey towards your thesis. So I will just give you a minute or 2 to do that. I'm also going to grab my thesis. So if you're online, if you'd like to put any of that in the chat, that would be great, and Helen will respond. And I'm sure there will be some common themes to that. If we have time at the end of the day, we're going to ask you to repeat this exercise. But if we don't have time at the end of the day, it is something that can be quite useful to think about, because often when you start your research journey, you will have a quite idealized, aspirational view of what a thesis looks like, and you will feel that there is a big gap between that and where you're at or where you're heading. Hopefully, as time progresses, this gap narrows and you start to see emerge in terms of what you believe a thesis is like, and what your own thesis is like. I would also say at this point, if you've never read a thesis for the level you are working at, I would strongly recommend that you do that. You don't need to read 20 or 50. 1 or 2 is fine. And actually, to some extent, the topic doesn't matter. It's just getting a sense of what one is like. And depending on the one you pick, that can be quite reassuring, actually, because we do sometimes have this quite sort of aspirational view of PhD and DBA and even master's thesis. And I've examined a lot And I can say that there are very few in the end that end up being this sort of idealistic idea. But you can repeat this exercise. It's a sort of abbreviated version of the 20 statement test, obviously only doing 3, but it allows you to compare what your thinking is with the ideal. And of course, the other point to bear in mind is that your institution, and I know we have people online from different institutions, will have a specific set of requirements. And at the beginning of the process, you don't need to worry too much about those, but obviously there's quite a big admin task as you approach the end that it's worth making sure that you are aware of. And your supervisory team will also have views on your thesis, what it should like, how it should read. And very often that's based on their own personal experience, either their own actual thesis or ones they've examined. But all theses, and especially qualitative theses, vary hugely. There is not an ideal model. There are some themes, and we'll go through those today, but they do vary enormously. And of course, the most important thing to remember is there's no perfect thesis. And certainly when you get towards the end of it, the very well-known saying goes, the only good PhD is a finished PhD, and that sometimes people get into a state of sort of continual refinement that can go on for some time. And actually there comes a point where most supervisors will say, just submit it now, it's done. And of course, in most degrees, research degrees that you are likely enrolled in, while the PhD thesis is or feels like the overwhelming part of your degree. I mean, we've got DBA students here, you obviously have assignments as well. In nearly every research degree that I know, there will also be a viva or a defense of that thesis, and that is also a significant and somewhat overlooked for most of the PhD journey part of it. You know, the thesis is one part, but you do also have the opportunity to do a defense, and we still do, certainly in Swansea, what I call a traditional defense, not one of these big fancy public defenses with swords and all sorts of things that they do in Scandinavia or much of Europe, where it's a slightly different experience, I believe. Any questions on this general view of a thesis? Anything online, or are you managing those?
We've got some stuff in the chat. We've got some descriptions and thoughts as to what people view a qualitative thesis to be. Jennifer has said qualitative thesis is long. That's in capitalization. Qualitative thesis has no pictures. Another assumption. And Jan has talked about the fact that other things that come to mind are words, coding, participants. Andrew has said a qual thesis was in depth, rich and interesting. And he said that his thesis is contributing to knowledge, insightful and interesting, to him at least. I'm sure it is to others too, Andrew. We've got other words that come through like participants, in-depth information, understanding, participant focus, participants and experts, researchers and recorders. We have someone that says their qual thesis is ambitious, that's Omalola, ambitious and daunting.
Well, there's some very good descriptors in there, and we'll discuss a lot of those as we go through. The other thing that we're going to do as we go through is I've examined quite a lot of PhD theses, and my common feedback when people talk to me about writing theses is sometimes I think students believe that the examiners find a quiet spot with a nice cup of tea and sit down and read it from start to finish while making copious notes and remaining fully engaged at all times. I'm not sure that is a description I've ever heard a colleague use when describing reading a thesis. Normally it's read on a train between meetings, at the end of the day, at the start of the day, I don't know anyone that ever reads a PhD thesis when they're examining it in one go. And so while we're talking through today, I will mention quite a lot of times the importance of keeping your reader with you and signposting it and structuring it so it's easy to read, because I guarantee your examiners and your supervisors, when they're reading it, will pick it up and put it down a lot. They just won't. I mean, there's in the room, this is mine in a binder. I mean, you know, that's a weighty thing, 100,000 words. This is Helen's. We bought the cheap versions with us today, as you can see. Okay, so I would encourage you to do that exercise of revisiting what you think a thesis actually is, what you think your thesis is, and hopefully you'll see this sort of narrowing of ideas across. This is the official, which I've just cut and paste, so sorry it's a bit small, definition for Swansea University for the Doctorate of Philosophy. And of course, the PhD degree varies, just like other degrees vary across institutions, but I mean, they vary in format and in structure and whether you're doing one book-like thesis or by publication. But the key tenets of a PhD are pretty universal, and much of this will apply to the DBA too. And so these 5 bullet points down the side are your sort of watchwords that, again, it's worth being, I mean, don't get obsessed by them, but it's worth being reasonably familiar with them. Much is made of the first one, an original and significant contribution to knowledge. I think sometimes we think Marie Curie here, as though we've got to be breaking all bounds and coming up with something entirely novel. And while significant is a weighty word here, contribution to knowledge can be incremental. It doesn't always have to be ground-breakingly, sort of eye-wateringly difference. Giving evidence of originality of mind. I love this one. Originality of mind, critical judgment in the conception and implementation of a research project. I mean, a lot of this is about evidence that you've completed a big piece of research. Containing material worthy of peer-reviewed publication. That does not necessarily mean it has been peer-reviewed. No doubt we will discuss at some point the slightly varying opinions that there are on whether you should be trying to publish within the scope of your, particularly if it's full-time 3 years of PhD, or whether that's something that comes afterwards. And there's a lot of different views on that. Being satisfactory, and here's where the examiner's judgment is key, in its literary and or technical presentation and structure, that's the actual content, with a full bibliography and references. And that's Helen's favourite part of the thesis. And for me, one which is almost the most important thing, demonstrating an understanding of the context of the research and mastery of the skill and methods of research associated with the field. Essentially, a PhD or a DBA or another higher research degree is a researcher apprenticeship. It is supposed to be a closely supervised and supported research project during which you learn how to do academic research. Now, I mean, certainly those of you in the room, and I'm sure many of you online, will have come to an advanced degree with all sorts of other sorts of experience. I was a management consultant, so was Helen. This is purely coincidental prior to being an academic researcher, and I thought I knew quite a lot about how to find things out in organizations. But there is a very particular and specific sort of knowledge acquisition and skill acquisition that goes on in terms of learning how to do academic research and the methodological basis for that is very different, I think, from much that happens in practice. And as I've already mentioned, the Viva Voice examination, or the Viva as it's often called, which is your discussion, hopefully. That should be the aim. It should be a chat with your examiners once they've had a chance to read your thesis. So again, I would, as my advice so far, read a thesis. Also, make sure you're aware of the regulations for your particular research degree. Word length count varies quite a lot, actually, across institutions and across different types of degree. The word length for a DBA is lower than the word length for a PhD. Sometimes a DEd or a Doctor of Education is also slightly different from a PhD, and there will be ones within your institution that vary. So particularly as you get to the writing stage, having a good sense of, are you aiming at 70, 80, 100,000 words is quite useful, because you don't want to overshoot. And while that may seem like a vast, these look like vast weighty tomes, if you're at the beginning, there's a lot of left on the cutting room floor in both mine and Helen's theses. Okay, so I think what we wanted to do then, so I've got one more slide, sorry. So yeah, a thesis is essentially the story of your research journey. In my view, it needs to be a reflective, particularly given it's qualitative, pretty much warts and all, maybe not every single wart, but an honest account of what you did. It is written for a very specific audience. My mum had a copy, but I'm pretty sure she never read it. Helen's mum will have read hers, however. There aren't that many people that are going to read the whole thing, other than your supervisor and examiners. What you're aiming to do is to coherently and clearly explain how you've met those degree requirements to which you're submitting, and that will largely be assessed by the examiners. The examiners write a report, and Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never seen an instance where, unless there was some misconduct that was identified by the university in either the Viva or submission, that examiners' views have ever been overturned. The external examiner generally has more weight than the internal examiner, but the aim is for them to agree on the result of the Viva and indeed the entire degree. Oh no, that's wrong. Where's that? All right, forget that. We'll come back to that. So we're going to give you a quick overview of our thesis, and we're not going to walk you through all 100,000 words, but we thought it was useful to give you a quick overview, and we brought props with us. This is, for those of you in the room, this is the very binder that I took into my Viva. It is quite heavy. I had to take in, I had a in-person Viva at the end of 2007, very stressful. One of my examiners is Professor Nick Beach, now the Vice Chancellor of Middlesex University, was at Scotland at the time, was flying down for my Viva, and it was snowing. There was an awful lot of stress, largely by me, about whether he'd actually get here, but he did. There are many other, everyone's got an interesting story to do with a Viva. There's another one which I will tell people off camera at some point. So I had to take in a clean, solid copy, unbound. So that's why mine's in a binder. It's not quite clean. There's a little, I don't know if those are, it's a little scrap of paper that was actually stuck to the inside of the folder, which was my research questions that I was terrified, completely terrified that I would forget in the Viva. Of course, I didn't forget them. And I'd obviously, this was the version that I had stuck on my laptop. So it's actually got a few edits that went on during the writing period, and that still sits in there. And for some reason, I also have a post-it note with the word count of the appendices. I've no idea why I thought that would be useful. So that's that. So my PhD was completed in 2007. I did 1 year part-time, followed by self-funded, followed by a 3-year full-time ESRC funded PhD at Birkbeck, University of London. And I was interested in the construction of knowledge. I tried to explain it to a friend once and said, "Oh, you're doing a PhD on bullshit." No, that's not what I'm doing. This is a serious academic study. Although since then, people have written about that in a serious academic way. So perhaps I was. So I was interested in professional knowledge and the way in which people did being knowledgeable or being ignorant at work, how they claimed knowledge for themselves and particularly their profession. And I was really interested in this in terms of the construction of the HR professional. Without going into a lot of detail, there was a big thing at the time about the move to the business partner model and HR professionals becoming strategic partners in the organization. So I was particularly interested in that. So I would have called at Birkbeck, at the University of London, they read out your PhD titles when you graduate. I would have called it something far more witty if I'd realised that was happening. They don't do that at Swansea, so you're all right. So I had 3 research questions, trimmed down from a one-time list of about 70. How do HR professionals discursively construct knowledge and perform knowing? What constructions of HR professional knowledge emerge? In what ways are the different constructions enacted? And I did a year-long ethnography at a very large investment bank in London. And that ethnographic mode of data collection was combined with a discourse analytic approach to the material I conducted. And I spent quite a lot of time in great throes of angst around this particular methodological combination of ethnographic and discourse analytic, which is doesn't exactly marry in ontological and epistemological terms. So I sent myself a particular methodological challenge to make that work. And so I wrote as much methodologically on the back of my PhD as I did on the topic, although I did also publish quite a lot on the topic all after my PhD. I would say that on the whole, I had a relatively smooth ride through the PhD process, if you don't count getting divorced in the middle. But there's always some sort of life event that happens during a PhD. That happened to be mine. But it took me much longer than I anticipated to organise access for an ethnography. For those of you not familiar with the term, ethnographic research basically means you are there in situ as much as you possibly can be. I was in the bank, different locations, 3 days a week for a year. And therefore, getting permission to do that is quite tricky. I traded quite a lot on my pedigree, if you like, as an ex-Accenture management consultant. So in the end, the bank were quite keen that they thought they'd probably get something, they did, get something for free that they might otherwise have had to pay for. But there was then a big merger of 2 banks and they delayed it for nearly 6 months. So there was a little bit of angst around actually getting in. And then I spent a year doing nothing but listen to people talk and getting permission to record things and doing lots of different consent forms and gathering lots of data. And then a year writing up at the end. The first year part-time, I just really floundered around quite a bit, actually. And I submitted within my ESRC timeframe. I think that's probably enough from an overview. So discourse analysis is also a quite broad church in terms of qual methods, and I put myself loosely in the sort of broadly social constructionist, critical with a small c discourse analysis, not critical discourse analysis with a big C, D, and A, for all sorts of reasons. And I spent more time reading and working on my understanding of ontology, epistemology, and methodology than I did on the topic areas of my thesis, because those were actually the more significant theoretical challenges, and is tied up with this notion of knowledge in any case. So there was a bit of a win-win there. I had to read all that stuff anyway. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Helen.
Yeah.
And I'll run back to carry my thesis back with me.
So my PhD was very different to Katrina's. I'm just going to get rid of this here. I've sent a link in the chat for people who are online, so you can access the online copy. I just said Katrina's is not available online, but I don't want to say that you're going to, what do you want to do?
I can email.
But Katrina will email it if you ask for it. My thesis is all about trying to understand individuals that set up businesses or enterprises, depending on how you want to term them, and suddenly need to employ people. And those people who set up and start up businesses in the UK tend to be identified as entrepreneurs. And I was really interested in this identity and this construct of entrepreneurship, and how it shaped the experiences of individuals, particularly when it comes to the employment relationship and what actually happens. So how does entrepreneurship shape that relationship? You can see my main research question here. How do entrepreneurs experience the transition from non-employer to employer? So quite specific. And that key word in my PhD was experience, which lends itself to the positioning of my work and tends to be the positioning of my own kind of worldview, which is around phenomenology and the privileging of individual experiences as a way of understanding our world. So I had a session with some of the DBA researchers here this morning, so you're going to be hearing some of the same stuff again about it. So I was really interested in that transition, and because I was using phenomenology, and in particular a methodology called interpretive phenomenological analysis. Try saying that after a gin. And that meant that it was all about fine-grained detail and really trying to make sense of these individual people's worlds in as much depth as I possibly could. So with IPA, you have a very small sample size because it's about depth, not breadth. And I conducted 15 interviews. I only used 10 of those in my actual PhD. So I have a sample of 10 in my PhD. And those interviews are around 3 hours long. And in order to facilitate that depth, I took Lego and used what we call a kind of elicitation tool or objects into those interviews to get my participants to help build and construct their experiences with me. And that was really because of some of the limitations that were there in the literature. And I read a lot around phenomenology and phenomenological methods, what was required. And phenomenology is a big philosophical kind of paradigm, if you like. Well, I don't really like the word paradigm, but for want of a better term currently. And for me, language isn't always enough to be able to express what we go through in life and some of the experiences. And ultimately, when you're interviewing people for 3 hours, you're not just going to talk about accounting and budgets and stuff. You're going to be talking about life. And the whole point of doing a phenomenological interview is you're interested in the whole experience. So that depth of experience. And what that the Lego is designed to do was try and encourage participants to talk a bit more about that. And we've got some stuff, we've talked about that in a previous Twilight session, so I won't go on too much about the methodology, but Lego and that construction of experience was a real theme for my PhD. And this idea that assumptions and the assumption around entrepreneurship was really just that, and these assumptions were shaping these people's lives, not always in a particularly positive way, despite the fact that entrepreneurship predominantly in the literature was constructed as an overwhelmingly positive phenomenon, both socially, economically, fiscally, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it was about having the construct of entrepreneurship as a positive phenomenon and using my participant experience as a way of showing how actually when you're living out an entrepreneurial ideal, it's not necessarily as utopic as the literature suggests, and particularly the academic literature suggests. My PhD was 3 years in total. I started it in October 2017 and submitted it in September 2020. So my Viva was in December 2020. So I wrote up in the midst of lockdown. So I had nowhere else to go other than one room to write up, which was quite helpful. My PhD, I pretty much did the full write-up. It took me 6 months in total from start to finish to write up and get it to a point of submission. It was really challenging. It was really difficult. I think lockdown meant it was, there are both benefits in terms of forcing me to actually sit down and do it. But the con was I had no touch points. My Viva was quite isolating, and I was just in front of a computer, and my dad walked in halfway through with a cup of tea, which is great. And I was mortified because my parents were going to support me when it was happening, and they said, we'll go out, we'll take the dog out, because I've quite a naughty dog who makes quite a lot of noise. We'll take the dog out for you. And so I thought they weren't in the house, and I was kind of in the midst of this, and suddenly in the background there was just this, I'll go for effect. Right in the background, when I was trying to kind of construct some sort of real, like, in-depth epistemological argument, which turned out not to happen. And this is what I used in my Viva. This is the one I took in, so it's got all sorts of notes on it, etc. I had the benefit of being online as well, so I did have some kind of post-its with my research questions on, etc., just to remind me of what was what. But it was a real, I was completely exhausted by that point. I was absolutely done for, and I'd been doing a publication at the same time, a revise and resubmit publication. So there was a lot going on in my head, and I was completely and utterly exhausted with it. And my PhD is something that I'm immensely proud of. I'm proud of it because for me, it tells us the story that I wanted to tell. And for those of you that can see it, you'll see that I started my PhD with the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. And I actually asked the photographer, this is a New Zealand photographer, I asked her permission to use these Lego pictures. She created the Emperor's New Clothes in Lego, and I wanted the theme for my PhD to be around this construction and, the factor assumptions are constructed, etc. So that's the kind of other side of it. So for me, the Emperor's New Clothes, a cautionary tale, that was something which was my theme, that was my hook throughout my PhD. And that's something which kind of I wanted to hold everything together with. So for me, it was all about making sure that that story was held right from the start all the way to the end. And that was a personal thing for me to get that across. I felt that was something that I wanted my participants told me about. And it's something that, if no one ever reads it, I know that at least if someone picks up, it will be in there. So that was for me. So that was my PhD.
I think it's probably just worth I've got sound coming out in all sorts of places. Highlighting that there are some similarities and some differences. Shall I stand up there?
Oh, yeah, I'll move up there.
So there are some real differences. So even across two qualitative pieces, and which I was involved in both of, they are hugely different. I had in my when I talk about my ethnography, I had 96 analysed events in my thesis. So I had 96 in a year of data collection, followed by discourse analysis. Helen had 15 3-hour interviews. So I had much more breadth, and Helen had much more depth. We had very different epistemological positioning. IPA is one form of phenomenology. We did a session on epistemology the other week, and I couldn't say that. One form of phenomenology, which is very different from my discursive positioning. So they are, and I didn't have although I'd done a lot of visual research between the PhD and supervising Helen's, I didn't have any visuals or objects. A little bit talk about space, and geography, but that was it. So they are very different. So when we talk about a thesis walkthrough, and people talk about, oh well, a literature review does this and a method does that every thesis that I've ever read is different. And so when we go through the sort of detail, we're doing it, asking you to sort of hold in your head that we're walking through two very different approaches. And the same would be true if we were talking about quantitative thesis, which we don't do because we're not experts. But, every qual thesis has a slightly different methodological orientation. But I guess what you see in ours, if you have a look at them, is they are probably at the sort of upper end of the spectrum in methodological complexity, partly because I think the PhD in particular is your real opportunity to go big or go home, basically. Yeah. I knew I would never have another opportunity to do a year-long ethnography. It just doesn't happen in research terms. You just, when you're working full-time, you just, as an academic, you just don't often get that chance, which is why I wanted to do ethnographic research. Same is true a little bit of IPA. It's really hard work, IPA, methodologically working through that 7-stage analytic. I did say to you at the time, are you sure you want to do this?
Yes.
Would you do it again?
No.
No. So you don't just roll out IPA every time you do a few interviews, because it's a really tough analytic methodology. So both of us took slightly more complicated routes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think what the plan is now is to kind of take you through each of the core chapters that make up the thesis. And just a caveat for those of you who are MSc or MA level, think about, and you might be thinking about PhD, but I want you to think about the fact that your MA, MSc is a much reduced version, but the broad structure and this idea of telling a story and a narrative and thinking about your methodology, it's all the same principles. So it's the broad structure is the same. It's just a much reduced version, 7,000 to 15,000 words generally.
As opposed to, is a DBA 70,000, Simon?
Our professional doctorate regs say up to 80,000. Okay,
so about 80. PhDs vary between 80 and 100. I think these days it's very rare for anything to go over 100. We even had to stick some things in appendices to get to Helen's down.
Yeah, but they're back in.
And then the examiners asked.
So this is 120,000 words with the additions.
Should we go through? I was going to say, rather than go through a break, should we go through one of them and then have a break?
Yeah.
Do lit reviews.
Or do you guys want to? What do you think?
Keep going.
Keep going, or
keep going. We'll keep going. Okay. Have you got the first one? Oh, go back and sit down.
Oh, is it me? Yeah. Oh yes, it's me. Orange.
Orange.
So literature reviews, which kind of links a little bit to what we were talking about today and earlier. So the literature review is my favorite part. I have to say I'm quite good at writing literature reviews. And I'm getting better at writing literature reviews. When Katrina and I write papers, I tend to like writing the literature review. Katrina bosses the methods and the discussion.
So discussion. Yeah.
And introduction. So everything else. And analysis. I like doing the analysis bits. So with the literature review, my literature review, and I'll talk about it from my perspective, mine was a very complex literature review, and in fact it was an absolute beast to write. For those of you that you might have access to it online, and you guys are welcome to have a look at this one if you want to. So the key thing here is that your literature review is all about how it fits with the problem or the challenge or the research question that you're addressing in your thesis. And it should be written very much from a critical perspective, so it's not like a textbook. And as I was saying earlier, when I first began my literature reviews, in order to get my head around the topic, because the entrepreneurship literature and my topic also involved human resources, it also involved organisation, it involved management. yeah. It meant that for me, I had to write a textbook to really get my head around that. But a textbook, as you see, it's very descriptive. It's just about saying what things are, not necessarily critiquing or finding problems or challenging how that knowledge was constructed. And so that's the first point with it, when it comes to a literature review, is picking what is the purpose of your review? What are you reviewing? What's it going to tell your reader or your examiner? And I think that's a core part to kind of get started, but when, like, what's the purpose of doing it in the first place?
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
So Helen and I had quite a long discussion, and in fact I have it with all my PhD students about the need to, what I call, write through stuff. Sometimes you need to write through a topic, and you need to write quite a lot, much of which will not end up in your thesis. I, for one, and I know Helen did, pretty much everybody I know that's done a PhD has a whole nother set of documents called cut from chapter X that you're terrified about deleting because you spent all that time writing them, but actually then no use to man the beast. So sometimes you just need to write out the descriptive stuff, the generic stuff, to enable you to write the one paragraph that will be in your PhD. This seems to be pretty common. Some people may be much more able to write more concisely, and now I'm a lot better at it than I was during my PhD. But it is still sometimes a case where I'll have to write 2 or 3 pages somewhere and then go, okay, actually what I want to write is these 6 lines. And that is okay. But you do have to remember that that takes time. So you need to allow for the fact that you're probably going to write, if your thesis is 100,000 words, you might actually write 2 or 3 times that number of words through the process of this writing through.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I'd say when you're doing, and depending on your design and the position you come from, so with IPA and a lot of kind of phenomenologically rooted work, you don't really, so I didn't really write my literature review until the end, because I was dictated by my findings, and what my findings were that's the kind of foundation and bedrock, you know, what the findings that came from my analysis. So I couldn't really finish my literature review. So I wrote kind of the starting point. I had an idea of the core literature in the field. I had an idea of the methodological, you know, how knowledge was constructed in the field. So I had all that, but I couldn't really write my literature review until the end. And it actually was the most difficult chapter for me to write, and it was most frustrating. I have 11 versions of my literature review, 10 of which are in a bin somewhere. And that was because I struggled to communicate what I wanted to communicate with the amount of literature I had to review. I had to review that in the literature review alone. There are 300 articles, 300 separate pieces of literature that were reviewed. So it was a huge piece of work. And I had to come back to it after my findings. So traditionally, what you'll find is people's PhD in their first years is you do your literature review, you know, and that's completed and that's job done. And with a qualitative piece of work, you're dictated most of the time by where your findings take you. So you will always be revisiting it towards the end, which just goes to that last piece there. And I guess the other thing to note is there is always a system to literature reviews. So we have heard increasingly that there tends to be a view that you must include some form of systematic review or process in a PhD. Our view is that a review is always a form of a system, and there are lots of different other types of reviews that you can use in your review. I used what's called a problematizing review, which is a very reflexive type of reviewing, which is about reviewing very selectively and thinking about problem, thinking about how knowledge is assumed and constructed within a particular discipline and where those assumptions have come from.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody needs a system for managing access to the literature they're referencing and understanding how which sort of avenues of exploration are going to be more useful in the PhD and which are not. I am not an advocate of a literature review by volume, just to demonstrate that you've seen a lot of stuff. That doesn't really, if I'm examining a PhD, that isn't something I look for. I am keen on this bit, demonstrating a sound understanding of the field with a critical review of classic and contemporary literature. Another thing that some people do is write a history. And again, sometimes you need to write through the history of a concept in order to get to your understanding of it. I had did a whole load of reading on the philosophy of knowledge. I didn't write very much about it in my thesis at all. But I did go back and read Polanyi, who is the person who is usually credited with defining the difference between explicit and tacit knowledge, and discover that very few people actually read Polanyi's 1969 small red book that I became very familiar with. So you do need to make sure that you're going in depth, but I'm not a big fan of the sort of claim that somehow calling your literature review systematic and showing some big numbers is necessarily an indication that you've done a quality literature review. But I do think this last point that Helen mentioned, it's often the first thing you start to write and nearly the last thing you finish, because essentially you're top and tailing your whole thesis with your literature review and your discussion, your contribution. So you have to clearly set up what you are contributing to in your literature review, and then you come back to that in your discussion. And that's now something that probably is a little bit formulaic, how we sometimes do it in academic papers, but when you're writing an academic paper, that is absolutely the key. Your contribution has to rest on something, and it rests on the literature review. Sorry, I'm going to sit down again.
Do you guys have any questions on any of that?
And then we'll take a short break.
Is there anything online?
I don't know, because I've been standing up.
Oh,
just sit down
for
now.
goodness sake. Yeah, doing all the work here. One thing I would say is, and this goes, well, I'll repeat this a little bit in the theoretical framework, is this is where having a really good, not sophisticated, just good enough understanding of ontology and epistemology and how that influences research design can really help you when you're reading and critically reading literature, because it's about understanding how a researcher's position, and that might not always be obvious, but it'll be very obvious from the methods and the methodology, how that has impacted the conclusions of particular articles and therefore the construction of knowledge in that particular field. So understanding that and the orientation of the particular body of knowledge. For example, entrepreneurship has a very positivist and realist orientation. So I was tackling it from a relativist position. So therefore, for me, I was reading the literature from a relativist position. So understanding those things are quite important. And I definitely recommend, for those of you that didn't manage to catch it, our previous session on ontology and epistemology can help. Not that I'm plugging it, but it just helps give you a bit more of an idea of where your position will mean that you'll be reading literature differently to someone who might be doing a quantitative study.
So Andrew was asked online about stopping reviewing the literature, and I guess one I don't know if they'll be able to hear me. Will they be able to hear me?
I don't know. Do you want a roaming mic?
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll just stand and talk anyway.
No, it's not charged, I think. Oh no, we're on. Oh, or maybe not. Does that work? Yes. Okay, so knowing where to stop. I mean, in one sense, you don't stop, because I read all the time. I mean, that sounds a bit pompous, but I look at things to read all the time. And so the whole thing is where you stop your thesis. I think you stop when you have sufficient for a contribution that will allow you to cross the PhD line. And so you will carry on reading because you do need to make sure that you're aware. I mean, it's always sod's law that some great bloody paper is published the day you submit your thesis. So you will keep reading, but don't keep rewriting, I think is the difference. Carry on reading, and you may be able to plug some citations back into your literature review. But once you've got the hooks for your contributions set up, I would say you're not reading other than to keep up to date with the topic.
Yeah, and I'd say, yeah, I would also say on that it depends very much on how narrow your topic is as well. Because with mine, I definitely got to a point where, because I was, despite the fact there was so much literature, there were key papers that I kept coming back to and just kept reappearing themselves. So I knew then that I was in this sort of recursive cycle of, well, these people are just talking about the same thing. So there's no additional hidden bit of stuff that I haven't found. So I did find that pretty much that they were just the same stuff coming back again. And even in new publications, they would still cite papers which I'd already been through. And so I felt very much quite comfortable that I had reached a point where I was happy that where the narrow points that I was looking at, I had covered what I needed to be able to talk about it in my viva, which is the other key thing.
Yeah, and an examiner will likely have a sense of who they are expecting to see cited, one of whom is, of course, themselves. Cite your examiner, always. I got asked to examine a PhD. It was the first one I examined, actually, and it was on the construction of professional knowledge for a different group than I'd done. And they didn't cite me. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Didn't review what I'd published by then. And I mean, wasn't a problem other than they hadn't taken it in a direction that I thought they needed to. But citing your examiner is a pretty safe strategy. Knowing what your examiners have written and their views on the topic is absolutely critical. I had another, so my two PhD examiners were Nick Beach and Nelson Phillips. Nelson Phillips is quite big in discourse analytics circles. And after I'd submitted before my viva, he had a bit of a run-in an academic, one of these conversation pieces about different forms of discourse analysis. And I was terrified that he was going to ask me what I thought of this in my viva. So I read it morning, noon and night for every day between I submitted it. It didn't come up at all. So that was a waste of time. But if I hadn't read it, he would have asked. So, you know.
Any other questions? Online? Any insights?
Andrew's thanking us for our sound advice.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. You can invoice us later when you passed it.
Okay, shall we take it's now 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
So we were going to take a
5 minutes?
Oh no, I think we can't.
Be longer. 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10
right?
minutes.
We've got time for a.
Yeah.
We've got till 5. So
yeah. So if we come back and everyone rejoins us at
we'll leave the Zoom on.
Yeah.
We won't shut it off, but I will pause the recording.
Just so moving on to discuss probably what most people find the most challenging part, I would say, other than findings. This was actually my favorite chapter to write in my thesis anyway. And I think most people get confused on the basis of what a theoretical framework is. So a theoretical framework is not about a theory and what a theory is. Theory is a way of explaining phenomena and understanding phenomena in this world. This framework is about your positioning of your research. So this is where all those discussions on ontology and epistemology come into play. So this is where you essentially put out your roadmap, your positioning roadmap, if you like. And this provides the intent, your motivation as to why you're researching from that particular position, and the expectations. So this sets out the position. So it's, in essence, it's probably one of the most important chapters if you're going, you know, your DBA, PhD, even to some extent in your MSc or MA dissertation. Having a little bit of understanding ontology and epistemology is really crucial, because that then dictates your choice of methodology. So if the two don't really link, then that can undermine your research design. It just won't make sense. And this doesn't just happen at PhD level. Katrina often talks about in the review, in papers I've reviewed too, you will find that sometimes there is a disconnect between how researchers position themselves and the methodologies that they use, and therefore the methods that they use within them.
I would say I end up writing it in 80% of the reviews that I do for journals.
Yeah,
this is a problem. So it isn't just a PhD issue.
So on a breaking binaries perspective, this is one of the key issues that we want to try and address, is really getting people to understand around positioning, understanding the importance of ontology and epistemology, not being experts in it. They are fields of study within themselves. You know, understanding all the different theories of knowledge is another world, but having an understanding of how it impacts your research and how it impacts how you see the world is probably the most important part. So when someone says to you, what is your theoretical framework? This is probably one of the most useful slides to help you understand what that is. That second bullet point hopefully will provide a bit of clarity as to what's expected from this chapter. And so for me, in my PhD, I called it a theoretical perspective rather than framework. And that's because this is Did you?
Yes. I didn't know that. I've only just looked.
Oh, I didn't know that either. Runs in the dynasty, clearly. That was really because I felt it was a perspective. Probably this chapter was for me, I'd done spent the most time thinking about writing this chapter. Aside from my analysis and the findings, getting the theoretical framework right was the most important. And because I was coming from a phenomenological position, I really felt I had to understand phenomenology, the different schools of thought within phenomenology, and then understand IPA, which is often proposed as a methodology, but it's grounded in the philosophy of phenomenology. So that meant I had to really understand the ontology and the epistemological thinking that phenomenology captured, and communicate that in a chapter. So that's what your theoretical framework. I want to read a theoretical framework chapter or theoretical perspective chapter and know how that researcher sees their world, and how they then justify their position in relation to the research.
Quick question, Helen, not to put you on the spot. How many pages is your theoretical perspective chapter?
It is.
So I'll tell you why I'm asking. Mine is 14 pages. So these are not
How many?
Huge. 30. Well, that's because I've got some different stuff in method that you had in there, I think.
Yeah.
So they don't have to be, mine's only 14 pages. So they don't have to be hugely long, but they are a critical setup to your research project.
Yeah.
And I think I wrote in mine, I had a whole subsection called the conceptual web of discourse, knowledge, power and identity, which was really where I sort of drowned in the problems. But I think the key here is that you're not going to suddenly come up with some aha moment that no one else has thought of, and that everybody struggles with this.
Yeah. So
this is you telling the examiners your struggle with this, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And research positions, ontology and epistemology it's all a collection of tensions, and your job is to work out where do you sit within these tensions and put that in this chapter. I'm just sort of reading some of the things in here. For me, part of my contribution was a contribution around the use of phenomenology and linking that in to some of the methodological gaps in the entrepreneurship literature. So I spent a bit of time just addressing that, because I brought it up in my literature review around, the construction of how knowledge was constructed and the positioning of knowledge within that field. And so I spent a bit of time doing that within there. And that was important for me to do that. And work through some of the inherent tensions and also drawbacks with phenomenology, and particularly IPA. There was quite a lot of recent, there was a scholarly fight, but there's some papers published around phenomenologies and methodology and how it wasn't really doing its job, particularly IPA. So I had to cover that in my thesis because I felt it was relevant, because one of my contributions was looking to address some of the known limitations through that object interviewing.
But there will always be a scholarly fight,
yeah,
relevant to your theoretical framework. There's always some argy-bargy going on where people are disagreeing about stuff, usually around really big stuff like agency,
yeah,
or power, or, you know, really, really tricky stuff. But there are many of them. The discourse one is discourse versus agency, and I had to explain that in mine. So it is much better to front up to these and go, these are the debates that are really central to the ontology and epistemological positioning I'm taking. You know, I'm not going to resolve them, you know, but it's important to recognize these debates and to potentially align yourself with them. I spent quite a lot of time dissing critical realism, which I don't agree with at all, in mine. And, you know, I had to be clear that I was taking a stance in relation to that, and explaining why I was a methodological relativist, not a critical realist. So you do, there's a degree of, you know, fighting through it, but you're not going to resolve the big issues. You're not going to come up with a new definition of power or a new understanding of agency. No one's asking you to, but often I find when I examine a thesis, they've tried to sidestep all these issues and just go, oh, I'm doing X. And I go, yeah, but what do you mean by doing X? What do you mean? Phenomenology is a classic, crops up all the times. I've taken a phenomenological stance. Okay, which one?
Yeah.
Which one and why? And what do you mean by taking that stance? Because every stance has a different, you know, whole range of views. So too often, particularly PhD students, try to sidestep it and just, all right, this is much less critical, I should say, if you're doing an MSc or an MA. In those sorts of dissertation write-ups, you probably are just saying, this is the stance I'm taking, and a little bit of discussion. You're not really expected to go into it in this level of detail.
Yeah.
So when on your PhD journey, where did you like arrive at your position, and where were you like this is, I've seen the light now, this is where I'm at?
So I spent a lot of time searching for the light, and then I discovered that it didn't exist, and that everybody was similarly searching for the light. And it was much better just to explain my search. I wasn't going to explain the light. So I wrote a lot about my understanding of discourse and my understanding of the relationship between discourse and ethnography as I saw it. But I spent a lot of time. I even went to some weird conference on linguistic ethnography because I thought that might be the answer. I spent a lot of time expecting to find the answers in something I was going to read, rather than reading a lot of stuff and working out for myself roughly what I thought. This is something that went on throughout my PhD. I think that would be the same for you, Helen. You spent most of your PhD reading and understanding phenomenology.
Yeah, I read every book that was related to the phenomenological schools. So the key ones like Being in Time. I read Hegel. I read Heidegger. I read Merleau-Ponty. I didn't understand all of them, in all honesty, at the time.
Not good.
Because how would you, you know?
Most people do not understand these writers. Someone helpfully told me I had to read Foucault in French.
Yeah, told me to read German.
O-level C French wasn't really going to get me very far. And most people don't understand these works. And unhelpfully, obviously, well, not unhelpfully, they change their minds. So you
Yeah.
read one book of Foucault and it says something, and then you read another book and you go, well, you've just contradicted what you said in the one I read 2 weeks ago. And that's common in philosophy. I read huge amounts on structuration theory. I mean, loads of stuff I'm really glad I read, but I didn't actually use Anthony Giddens' stuff in my thesis. But being well read and understanding what the problems are with it is what the examiners are looking for. They're not looking for you to have resolved centuries of philosophical debate. That'd be quite intimidating if you had.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you don't want to occupy your time.
No, that's what's good.
Grappling with is, maybe hopefully you guys are is, you're reading the literature around the themes of your research, and you're also grappling with the epistemology and ontology, and doing the two at the same time. They're like, well, great, but just confusing. If you prefer a particular order to doing these things, or is it just to muddle along and work it out like that?
Yeah, it's being confused is part of learning and getting to a point where you're not confused. So you have to go through it, because it is very complex. Yeah. It's not stuff which we think of in our everyday lives, is it? So you've got to go through the kind of, this is really uncomfortable, I don't really get it. And once it's a bit like writing an assignment. You start with and going, I have no clue what I'm doing here. And then by the time you've finished it, you go, well, I actually have got some of it. And your literature, when you're reading literature, it runs in parallel. You'll kind of work out what you feel more comfortable reading, things that you like reading, things that speak to you, things that don't. And that in itself is part of the finding your way. And that was very much the case with me, is that there were particular articles which really spoke to me and I felt comfortable. I enjoyed reading really in-depth findings, for example, and reading reflexivity and research reflexivity and understanding how that related to research. So that for me, it kind of then, and I went, oh, well, if I enjoy that, then that's something that clearly where I feel comfortable with. Whereas, I was growing, quite uncomfortable with some of the more positivist and realist work, particularly within the area I was
This from someone who rocked up and said they were going to do a survey.
Yeah, because I was in a business school. I'd done I did IPA for my master's, but I thought because I was coming to a business school, I would not be able to do that kind of research. I thought that IPA in a business school was like, and it was, to some extent. But actually, because I had a supervisor that was supportive of that process and knew, you're all right, then that really helped. But because I was in the context, and that's for those of you as well who may be within places where there's not a lot of qualitative research, that was a big part of it for me, was finding individuals who were very supportive of what I was doing, which was mainly Katrina, actually, in the school, and my supervisors. So I think that's part of it. And talking with people who are doing similar kinds of research, going to conferences, you kind of recognize, you just feel comfortable in that world and in the way that you relate to that world, etc.
So one of the things I do as a supervisor, and Chen, we've already talked about this with your DBA, is encourage some form of pilot study quite relatively early on. If you're doing a full-time PhD, I'm talking around in the first year, towards the end of the first year. So you do some form of data collection, just so you understand what that's like. And then as a result of that, I usually ask people to play with data analysis. So we did it, didn't we?
Yeah.
You took some, I mean, you'd pretty much already decided you were doing IPA, but take some extracts from your interviews and try out discourse analysis, try out something that's a little bit more narrative, which is sometimes seen as a mid-ground between discourse and phenomenology. It's not, so, but pretend I didn't say that. And then discourse analysis. And most people feel more or less comfortable operating in a more interpretive versus a, giving more agency to the participant or less agency to the participant, more agency to the text, roughly. But doing one end of very interpretive to more discursive, gives people a sense of how to read data that aligns with some of this stuff. And from that, usually you will then find your home. I am much more critically discursive narrative than I am phenomenology. But I've supervised phenomenological PhD, so I'm happy sitting in that space. But when you're doing your PhD, it's usually easier to sit in one space. It just meant that when Helen wrote up, I had to go through and scrub out the word discourse whenever she tried to step outside that zone. But yeah, think of it as a zone. You're putting yourself in just for this bit of research. It's not your life, feels like your life work, I know, but it's not, you're not saying you can never do another form of research. And actually for publications, although my thesis is very discourse analysis heavy, some of my publications are narrative analysis. They've just pulled back on the critical element of discourse analysis to make it slightly more interpretive, because it's slightly easier to do in 10,000 words.
Katrina, do you mind if I ask a question?
No.
I mean, when you talk about critical discourse analysis,
Yeah, I'm using small c.
Indeed, but could you explain what you mean by critical in that context?
So Fair-Cloughian, this is a whole separate session. Fair-Cloughian critical discourse analysis, capital C, capital D, capital A, has 3 layers roughly that starts at a sociolinguistic detailed analysis, have sort of a middle interpersonal layer, and then a societal layer. And it's not often done very well, but I didn't feel that I had the either the detail that done properly, CDA, that the linguistic element is actually quite like conversational analysis. It's quite detailed linguistics, and I am not a linguist. I don't have any linguistic training, and I saw a lot of poorly done CDA that didn't have that spread from the linguistic to the social. So I say it's critical in that I sat in a social constructionist critical perspective. Hardy and Phillips did a nice little sort of diagram that allowed you to quote something and say you were critical but not capital critical. And so yeah, that's all in there.
That's really helpful.
So I have supervised a PhD, Christine at Birkbeck she did pretty full-on critical discourse analysis, but she used, as in Fair-Cloughian, but she used media discourses and participant data. So she had different types of data that allowed you to play with those levels better than I did. And I also had an ethnographic stance running through it, which didn't really fit with Fair-Clough's view of discourse in the world.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
But that's the sort of thing you need to be able to explain.
The theoretical framework.
The linguistics. What was it, the linguistics, the basis of it?
So CDA has 3 levels: the sort of linguistic, the interpersonal, and the societal. I might even be explaining that wrong because I haven't looked at it for a while. I mean, I read how to do conversation analysis, for example, because I needed to know, if I went right down the linguistic element, what I was going to be doing. So when we get to methods, I think reading around your method is as important as reading around your topic.
Yeah.
So, for example, I have a very strong view, which some people disagree with, that you cannot do a PhD that is simply 20 interviews and thematic analysis. You can do an MSc or an MA at that level, but at a higher degree, with full research degree level, you can probably do an MRes like that too. I would expect to see something more. It's slightly different with the DPA because you've got examined bits too. Mm-hmm. Sorry, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, so my question is, how much impact does this have on your literature review? And if it is fundamental, I mean, Why is it coming after the literature review?
It's coming after the literature review in your thesis. That doesn't mean that you don't start it, that you're not reading around all of this at the same time. But you need to review literature from all different perspectives, not just the perspective you're taking.
So if you think about your literature review is about setting up the contribution to the field of knowledge in which you're operating. But this chapter and your actual thesis has a positionality in and of itself, which is fundamental to your research design and the way that you choose to design the research to be able to fulfill the contribution that you set out. So just because it's in this position, so you really should have, you start to kind of be playing around with the idea of where you sit in relation to your research and what you want to research.
Right, but as you do the commentary in the literature review, should you be commenting based on your theoretical?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and that's so in mine I did, because that was part of my contribution, because I wanted to be able to show the reader about how there were core ontological assumptions that were influencing how the particular constructs I was looking at, the phenomena I was looking at, were being constructed in the literature and within academia more broadly. So for me, in my research, that was really important.
And similarly, I had two literature review chapters in my thesis, one about human resource management and one about knowledge. And in both of those, the detailed critique comes from the perspective I'm taking on the way that has been researched to date. It's a critique from a perspective. It's not a sort of every which way critique, but then I'm still having to review the literature around. There was a big HRM model about different professional roles, Ulrich's work. I still had to critique that, even though I would quite like to just push it to one side and say it's not relevant because it doesn't reflect anything that fits with my research. But because it was so well known, so much discussed, used by the CIPD to position the whole HR profession, I couldn't ignore it. I still had to review it, but I do that from my own stance. You will have a stance. Everybody has one.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, just so it's like almost on every page you're referring back to your framework.
It's more about the way that you're reading and critiquing the work. So an example would be within my work. So I was critiquing the fact that there is a lack of definition of entrepreneur. And yet it was being researched from predominantly a realist perspective, which assumed that there are things that you can go out there and identify. So you can do deductive research and theorize on something which supposedly exists. So you're an entrepreneur because you've got X, Y, and Z, because I've told you you're an entrepreneur. So therefore you are, because I've told you you are. So that's very much a realist position. Whereas if you feel, well, actually, I'm not at all, that doesn't sit with what I don't really understand, doesn't sit with me, that comes from the relative position, whereas your experience is, it's not that, in a very simplified way. So through my literature review, that was something which I was critiquing, was looking at how entrepreneurship had been defined and understood within the literature, because my position was a relativist position, which was that entrepreneurship and the entrepreneur is not out there to be discovered. It's something which is constructed through various narratives, etc., through the literature. But in my theoretical framework, I had to address a key tension, which was the fact that I had put entrepreneurs in my research question, which suggests that I can go and find entrepreneurs in my research to interview. So I had to deal with that, because I'm basically saying, and throughout my thesis, it's a construct, I'm a relativist, it's not out there to exist. But in my research question, I'd said, well, how do entrepreneurs experience? Which therefore is acknowledging that there are entrepreneurs out there, which is a kind of realist dilemma. So I had to talk about that in my theoretical perspective chapter, because it was something which was very, very much a tension. I don't know if that makes sense. Is this making sense to you guys? So that's something I had to put in my thesis, because I was basically acknowledging that something existed, but also contesting it at the same time.
And that working through is what an examiner is looking for. They're not looking for the sort of glossy, polished, oh, there's nothing to see here account. They're looking for you to show your working and your thinking and your struggle with making sense of that, because we all do that. Chip in, Simon, if you want, but we all from an examining perspective, we all do this. An examiner is not going in to look at a thesis thinking, I know better than this person what their theoretical framework is. They're not, because there's so much nuance around the particular position and the particular orientation to your particular data. What they're looking for is enough understanding of what you've been thinking so that when they read your analysis chapters, they make sense, because they're saying, okay, I know this is their position, so I'm trying to look at their analysis through their eyes and say, does it make sense?
That transparency is, with a qualitative thesis,
Yeah.
that level of transparency is key, because you are part of your research and you mediate and frame your research. So that needs to be reflected through your thesis.
And part of that's demonstrated in the language you're using.
Absolutely.
In the way that you frame that.
Yeah.
So, because I'm very much the same at the moment, you know, with the phenomenological approach, that took me 3 days to learn how to say.
I still get it wrong.
But when I started looking back at the words I was using as to how I describe things and I want to discover and what I find important, I found that I was naturally doing that without even knowing I had that kind of approach. So I found it very interesting and really useful to learn that there are different types of language associated with the different positionings that actually helped me to get where I think I am at the moment.
Yeah,
At the
and
start,
every now and
100%.
again, you need some stake in the ground that you hold on to for
Okay.
dear life and go, I might not stay here,
Yeah.
but thank God I've got somewhere to hold onto, and I'm just going to stay here for a while, and sit with it. And if I have to move, it's like, not that I watch this Ninja Warrior thing, you know, when they're eyeing up the next hangy thing, you know, you don't want to let go of where you are and launch yourself into space. This will make no sense on Zoom, apologies, before you grab that next bar. So if you've got something to hold on to and you've found a place that is comfortable, even if you're not sure if it's right, work it through with your supervisor and work through like a mini sort of storyboard, I would do, of what does this mean for each chapter in your thesis? What does this mean for my relationship with my participants? What does it mean for my understanding of something called data? What does it mean for what I might do analytically? I would mind map it because that's what I'm like, but people do things in different ways. And then have something that you hang on to. And you may stay there or you may depart, but at least then you'll know what you're leaving behind.
Yeah, I found the Saunders review really useful with the marking bit, just to have a look at, and actually I come out equal on phenomenological and on pragmatist, but that's just my brain just.
Is this the Mark Saunders book?
Yeah, it was just as a starting point, because this was all brand new for me, but it was just a little way of doing a multiple choice to help me understand.
Yeah, I would say you need to do it with something closer to your data or some extracts to be able to get a sense of how it really plays out. And it's funny when we talk through it, I am not, and partly because what you do in your PhD sticks with you. I'm not great about analysing people's experience. It's not something that comes comfortable to me. I'm much happier with narratives and discourses. Helen is not much, but more comfortable with the experiential side, which actually makes collaboration is quite good, because it allows us to make sure that we are consistently, we nag each other about it quite a lot.
Yeah, we do. I think that's, it's about, I think part of it also is you learn to be in where you are more, and it's that they're not where you are in your everyday life. Like phenomenology in IPA, it's like it's obsessive, like where the boundaries that are set and you have to sit within. You know, we call it like the suspension of the natural attitude is the kind of term. So that thing about discovery and these kind of scientific tools, we call it, you have to kind of, you go into a different mode of thinking, and you have to, and that's a learning process that you have to sort of go within. And it's really tiring because it's not, you know, I don't go around my everyday life going, I wonder how that ant experiences that leaf, you know.
That's 'cause you're not eating your vegetables. So eating your vegetables to do.
But when I'm faced with being within the kind of phenomenological, particularly with IPA, you go into that, and it's similarly with discourse, you go into a different mode, and all you're doing is just understanding the boundaries that introduces you. And that's all you have to do and show in your thesis or in your, you know, whatever it is you choose to do.
Can I just make one very quick point from the DBA perspective? Because I want to make a distinction between the literature review that you're working on now, that Stuart will be thinking about, all of you will be thinking about, which is a 6,000 word assessment, scoping things out, dipping your toe in the water, seeing what's there, then starting to think about structure after this workshop. But then the literature review for your eventual thesis will be an entirely different piece by the time you get there. And that's when there will be need to be much more overt reflection back to the rest of the theoretical position. So thank you.
If you smash your theoretical perspective chapter and you get really and you really dedicate yourself to it, it will make your life so much easier later on. And also, particularly for those of you that want to continue with any form of research, understanding the boundaries of your method will enable you to understand where other methods sit in relation to it. And that is something which I think is a really, you know, that's part of the green beret of doing a PhD or a DBA, is it allows you to be able to come out the other side and understand that there are different tools and there are different ways of thinking for addressing different challenges and different problems.
I think that's probably worth, perhaps we should have said that at the start. My view is very much that some people approach a PhD supervision and a thesis in quite an instrumental way, which is you find the route of least resistance and you get through it as quickly as possible, and then you move on to other stuff. That isn't the approach that I take, which is much more about this is your opportunity to immerse yourself in these sorts of issues and debates. You don't have that opportunity in your day-to-day working lives. You certainly won't have that opportunity if you become an academic. And there is stuff, like I said, I read Anthony Giddens' structuration theory, didn't use it in my thesis. Am I glad I read it? Yes. I read actor network theory, didn't use it in my thesis. Am I glad I know about it? Yes, I've used it in other ways since. So there's lots of stuff that I read, explored and did in my PhD that aren't in my 100,000 words, but they were still really valuable for me to do for what I am like as an academic now.
Any questions on theoretical framework? Anything online?
No, we've just, no, we're all right.
Okay. So we're going to move on to methodology and method. Is this not you?
Well, I don't know. It's orange up there, so no.
Oh, okay. So your theoretical framework should sit, and in my PhD, a lot of my methodology, which is the approach to the way that you conduct your research, a lot of that methodological stuff was actually in my theoretical perspective because it ties so closely to phenomenology, etc. I chose to sit a lot of that in my theoretical perspective chapter. But your methodology is your theoretical approach, which will link to your previous chapter, your theoretical framework or theoretical perspective, whatever you want to call it. So the methodology is the umbrella, that's the perspective, that's your position. The method or your methods are the tools and procedures, so how you actually conducted your research. And that all gets put in your research methods chapter. Some people call it a methodology, in which case you need to include stuff on your methodology, so the kind of the approach. But that's often a conflation that people make, is that methodology and method are the same thing. They're not. So if you want to ensure your methodology is included, choose where it goes. You know, again, it depends on, particularly within the qualitative world, it can sit either in your theoretical framework, or it might sit better there, or it might sit better as a chapter in and of itself. And again, you know, they rise in the levels of complexity with that. I wrote mine as a methods chapter. The methodology was very much sits around IPA, which is quite prescriptive. It provides a lot of information already on it. I wrote mine, pretty much my methods, and the biggest tip is, as you're doing your method, as you're doing your research, you can get it done, because it's quite procedural, it's quite literal, so it's quite easy to write, unless you choose to include things like objects and visual or photo elicitation and stuff, in which case that might add levels of complexity that you have to kind of acknowledge. You need to talk about your pilot. If you are doing empirical research, you should be piloting the methods that you're using. And if you haven't been advised to do so, then I'd go and have a conversation with your supervisor as to why you haven't, or you aren't, or you've not been advised to.
I wrote a paper on it, so you can always come and ask me for that.
Can cite Katrina's paper on piloting. So don't know why it's doing that. Let's go for that one. So I don't know where it's gone.
Well, the other one's still there.
I don't know if that can see it. Is that on that one? I don't know.
No, it's on the blank one for some reason. That's helpful. But that's all right, because we're sharing this screen anyway, so it doesn't matter.
No, but we're sharing. Oh yeah, that's true.
It's got this line.
It's not about everything that you've done and making it seem like it was all pretty and it all happened in the way it's supposed to, as it was in the textbook around the method that you read. This is again about that reflexivity point. This is exactly what you did and justifying what you did and why you did it.
Examiners often ask, it's a common question, what was the biggest challenge you faced during your empirical research, right? Because they know that probably what you've described in your method chapter is a little bit highly summarized.
Yeah.
I would much rather see the detail and the challenge.
And I put quite a lot of detail in mine. I don't know if you got it or you can see it online. I've included some awful selfies that I recorded videos after I'd done my interviews with participants to record my thoughts, frustrations. There was one where I actually spent quite a lot of time shouting at the camera after one of a really frustrating interview. So I wrote about quite a lot of those like fieldwork frustrations there. I mean, that picture is terrible. And that's in the British Library now forever. So maybe put a better picture in if you're going to do that. But I wanted to show the particularly with IPA, it's the findings are often very curated, and you spend so much time in your head. And there was a really great paper written by Sally Goldspink around kind of booming clangs and whispering ghosts. And it was all about when you're doing the analytic phases of IPA, just how much it impacts you as a researcher, because it's so in depth. And that really struck a chord with me. And particularly I was doing mine during COVID and lockdown. I felt I didn't really have any escape from my participants, so I became like a bit overly obsessed with them, and IPA sort of encourages that, maybe to the detriment of the researcher. So I wanted to write a bit about that in there. So there's a lot of reflexive stuff that I put in there, which actually originally wasn't in there, but the examiners asked, because it was sort of something, it was appendix, it's kind of optional if you wanted to engage with it. And there's field notes around each of my participants in there, that I'd made when I was kind of going into their various businesses and stuff, and I included in that. So my methods is full of quite a lot of that dirt, and quite although it's written up and curated in some way, I wanted to really get those emotions across, and that was what I felt was needed there. But with any form of qualitative work, there is that expectation of reflexivity throughout your methods, and that should be there, particularly in this chapter. That's something that needs to be there.
I think as well, so I doing an ethnography, whatever a qual method you use, you will have some form of odd relationship with your site of research. And I remember finding a PhD student's report of their ethnography, and it was called "In the Field, No One Can Hear You Scream." And it was the best methods paper I read when I was doing my PhD for a long time. And it was a really honest account of how they had felt during their ethnography, and how alone they had felt, how they had actually been somewhere overseas. I can't even remember where it was, but it was like, oh, well, I was in central London, but actually I felt all that two, I was neither part of the organization, or although I had a pass and I was there a lot and people knew who I was and asked about my kids and how I was and all this sort of stuff. I went out for drinks after work, but I wasn't an employee. But also I didn't feel like an academic when I was there, because I didn't feel like I was doing proper research, because I was just swanning around recording meetings and things. And particularly if you're doing research in your own organization, or in one that you know very well, or an area that you know very well, this whole insider outsider dilemma of who are you when you're doing a PhD is really challenging. And I think particularly if you do one slightly at a more mature stage, I didn't finish mine until I was 40, you don't fit what people expect you to be doing. It's a bit more common now perhaps than it was then, but you don't fit the sort of progression, and people don't understand why you've quit a job, or you're going part-time, or you're trying to do this on top of all the other things you should be doing. So I think it is a time that leaves you a little bit vulnerable, and gives some angst about your own identity, which is challenging when you're also trying to unpack what's going on for your participants and how they feel about things, or how they, whatever positioning you're taking on that. You're trying to make sense of something that's happening for them, while you're also making sense of something that's happening for yourself. And so that people don't write about that enough. But you won't have. I mean, my method section, I think initially was about 50,000 words.
Yes.
But I ended up putting a lot of stuff in appendices, like my some of my extracts from my field notes. I happened to be doing my ethnography in 2005 at the London bombings, so I was doing field work during the bombings, and so that was quite a big event for the organization too. There was, it was a really weird week to be there and understand how people were trying to find people and understand how they felt about the place they work and employees. It was really, that wasn't really relevant to my research, but it definitely shaped what happened. So it was quite interesting.
In terms of just tick boxes to think about in your research methods, things that are expected. So there needs to be some kind of what we would call an audit trail. So through your analytic, you will go through an analytic process with your data. So if you're doing a qualitative piece of research, you will pick a form of analysis. I don't know what level you might choose. And that will have an analytic method associated with it. And in your methods, that is where you detail what you did and how you did it. For me, with an IPA or anything with a kind of phenomenological focus, I'd expect to see personally those workings in your methods. So an example of there's different stages from a transcript, anonymized transcript. This audit trail is really important. So when you're going through and you're actually doing your analysis, it's important to think about what you want to include in your methods, because this is your point. Transparency is really necessary here, because you need to show your workings and show the stages that you went through during those analytic phases, and that's key to a really good quality methods chapter and really good qualitative work. It's not just about that reflexivity, but also that transparency and that audit trail from start. When you first pick up you've got your transcript, when you first pick it up and you start going through, and that needs to be recorded, those stages, the notes that you might make, record and keep those. They might come in useful at some point, and that. Though not everything needs to be in there, but you need to think about showing your working so that when an examiner, whoever reads it, they read that and they can see the stages that you took, so that when they get to your findings, we have a reasonable idea of how you got there.
So I had quite a lot in my methods chapter. I've just got it here. So I wrote down steps, but my actual step one was how on earth did I organise all the material that I collected during my ethnography? What had I done with it as I've gone along? How did I then try and come up with some ridiculously complicated coding system to organise my data? How did I deal with the different forms of data I got? I had emails, I had reports, I had PowerPoint presentations, I had interviews, I had loads of different sort of stuff. How did I anonymise it all? So there's quite a lot in mine on data management and actually being organised and thorough. Before I even get to what I actually did, what was transcribed, what was not transcribed, because not everything was transcribed, how I then analysed different types of data and organised it. And so data management is quite critical here. And then you would also want to ensure that you were using some guide of qual methods quality. Definitely, if you're doing qualitative methods, do not use some quant set of quality criteria like you know, validity and all that stuff. So you need to use a qual one. Tracy's is very good, and there's quite a lot out there.
Reinhardt, Creswell and Poth.
Yeah, there's quite a lot out there. We've got a question on the chat, which is about, would you be honest about errors, mistakes, poor management, delays, etc., that were maybe your or others' fault? I think it's something to work through with your supervisor. You don't want to do yourself down and the method that the examiners are not expecting to see, oh, you know, every error that you made along the way. I included quite a long section on how I ended up working with the particular organisation, because I actually had discussions with 2 or 3 organisations about doing an ethnography, and one I thought I was going into, and then they turned me down, and then I had this delay. And then I arrived, and the person who'd given me authority had resigned, and I was on a nightmare. So I did include that, and I included a couple of false starts I had. I at the time there wasn't much visual analysis around then in management stuff. I toyed with the idea about doing visual, but I didn't have ethical approval, so I couldn't. So I put all those in there. But it's those sort of things that changed your direction or impact what you have. We all have, I mean, no, that was my master's. I lost a whole load of recordings, but I think I did, I'm pretty sure I did that in my PhD too, because I was recording so much. I'm pretty sure I had stuff that I couldn't analyze because the recording had got corrupted, you know, and that was my fault. I hadn't backed it up in time, you know, so big things, but not little things that you might have had to redo, I think. If that makes sense, but always go through it with your supervisor, because what you don't want to do is put yourself down. If you've delivered a good quality bit of research, you want to, you know, claim that, not just list a lot of mistakes.
I would also say, just last point on research quality, that there's research quality broadly for qualitative research, but there's also quality in relation to your methodology as well. So it's important to understand what good looks like in relation to your methodology, as well as broad kind of qualitative research as well. But I'd recommend starting with Tracy's Big 10.
10 criteria for qualitative research.
Yeah. 2010.
Oh, is it 2010?
Yeah.
Is that recent?
Probably revised.
Yeah, there's quite, she's writing a new book actually. There's quite a lot of, there's Sage handbooks.
Yeah.
Come and go. Someone's got my 2 volumes at the moment of the Sage the 2017 Sage Handbook for Qualitative Methods in Business and Management. Probably we haven't gotten here, but we would also expect clear account of the ethical processes and procedures, which is not just a case of a load of tick box stuff at the beginning. Some aspects are really complicated. So ethnography is complicated ethically because you don't always know who you're going to bump into, and informed consent has to be managed on lots of different levels. Helen was doing stuff with stuff and pictures and anything with visuals is ethically slightly more complicated. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means you need to be aware of what the ethical implications are. If you're doing research in your own organisation, the ethics are a little bit more complicated too.
I think the key point is what you're probably getting is that there's so much to think about and consider, but that's why taking it chapter by chapter and just understanding what's needed chapter by chapter can just be a helpful way of just trying to not be overwhelmed by, you know, what can be quite a lot at one time. Any questions? Methods, methodology? We all right online? We're live.
Yes, we've just dealt with that question about errors and things that Joe put up.
Cool. Okay. So, Katrina,
Right.
over to you. We're almost there. We're in the findings section, then discussion, and then you're through a thesis.
Empirical context. Oh, do you want the little one?
The what?
This one, and you can chip in.
Oh, okay.
I'll give you a chance to chip in since I chipped in. We put empirical context on this slide, but there's often no right place in a thesis for the bit about the organisation or the sector or the sort of place that you are doing your research. In fact, I spent time moving mine. I'm actually having to check now. Mine is before my methods chapter. I have an empirical context chapter that is about the organisation I did my research in. Sometimes it's part of the methods chapter, and sometimes it's after the methods chapter. It just really is where makes sense for your research. And the key to the empirical context is you're only providing enough context for your examiners to make sense of your thesis. Sometimes you are find it's the thing that PhD students like to write the most because it's the bit that might be easiest.
What's that?
The context, your empirical context. So I was writing about what was this bank like? How was it organised? What roles did HR professionals do? How had they reorganised as part of a merger? It's relatively straightforward, and it's setting the scene. You might not have, if your research is situated in an organisation, it's about the organisation. If your research is situated in a particular locale, Helen's has stuff about the South Wales Valleys from memory, because that's where all her participants lived and worked. So you need some sort of context. When it comes to organising your findings, you can drive yourself nuts, because there isn't a best way usually to organise them. Usually there are several options, and you'd sort of get to the point at which you go, okay, I'm going with this one and I'm going to stick with it. My findings are organised by group in the organisation. I have a chapter on the, she says checking, the business partners. I have a chapter on the HR call centre, and I have a chapter on the HR training and development, learning and development group. I spent time with other parts of the organisation, but those are the three bits that I focus in on my findings. There are lots of different ways. I didn't have to do it by team. I could have done it all sorts of other ways, but generally, once you've got something that seems to work, it is easiest to stick with it rather than to keep trying to reorganize it, because you can get in a terrible muddle. The biggest thing that I have challenges with when I'm supervising is persuading students that they don't need to include everything in their PhD, not all their data, and certainly not all their analysis. There will be lots of things that are interesting, but they might not be relevant to enable them to answer a research question or to demonstrate a contribution. Everything that you put in your thesis has to fit into the need to present category rather than the nice to present category, because you just won't have enough room. And the work as an examiner, one of my biggest bugbears is reading 4, 5, 6 pages of data analysis and then never hearing anything about it again. Why did I just read those 4 or 5 pages if it's not going to contribute to answering your research question? You know, it might have been interesting to you, but you know, I'm on the clock here. I've got to read the whole 100,000 words. Don't give me another, 15 I don't need to read. So don't present everything. There are some common challenges around this. There's nothing on gender in my, which people might find surprising given I study gender now. There's nothing on gender in my PhD thesis, right? There could have been, right? HR profession is often discussed in relation to gender, right? But there's nothing in there in my PhD thesis because that was a whole extra, or would have been a whole extra research question, a whole extra literature chapter, a whole extra set of contributions that I just didn't have room for. And I spent quite a lot of time early on saying, is my thesis just about HR professionals' construction of knowledge? Yes. Okay. Is gender going to be one of the aspects of that? And the honest answer was no. So it's not in there. And it's about being confident about that you have enough to answer your research questions, that you're not just, sticking everything in. As I say, I had 90 recorded events in my ethnography. I don't actually know how many are in here, but I did do a table when I was doing my PhD to check that I got enough things from enough different places, because I became a bit paranoid that maybe I was concentrating on too little data. So I mapped it all out so I could, if anyone asked me, answer that question, but I don't remember the answer.
I think that's an important point, because on the being sure about and setting your boundaries, I had 2 similar discussions in my write-up where we had a discussion about whether we went down the identity route and looked at identity. But because I knew the literature so well, I knew there was already what I'd found. There was no contribution with identity because it had already been said in the identity literature. So it was, and I could have included a whole section of identity and used a particular concept of identity, but I chose not to do that. And I was able to justify that choice on the basis of what already was out there. So it's just being able to make decisions and justify them. Similarly, made the decision not to talk about liminality. And actually that was a question I was asked by my examiner as to why I chose not to do liminality, to which, I said it had been talked about, and also I wanted to publish on it, which was a bit of a get out clause, but we'll publish on it. Get around to that.
Yeah,
so just justifying.
One of my PhD examiners, Nick Beach, big name in the identity literature. I have published since on identity using data from my thesis. However, there is nothing about identity in my thesis. It is all about the discursive construction of knowledge by HR professionals. I stayed very firmly in a bounded set of 3 research questions, and I didn't go outside it. And that may sound, you could have done this and you could have done that, but it's a funnel that we talk about, funneling all the time. You start off thinking, I might do all these things. And as I have told Jen and Helen, I once rocked up at a PhD supervision session with 71 research questions. That went well. We've all been there wanting to do all this stuff, but you really end up focusing, because it is about depth, and to make the contribution, you need the depth. So you don't need to present everything. Spend a lot of time with students going, that's interesting, but you don't need it in there. You must answer your research questions. And at this time in a qualitative thesis, when you are doing the analysis, you're still changing and, but I can see now on mine, I've got, must have been quite late in the day.
my last research question had been, in what ways are the different constructions of knowledge deployed? Deployed was changed to enacted. So that disappeared. There's also another version on there, so I'm not actually sure which the final one is. The rule of three. So the rule of three is every PhD chapter has 3 chunks of data or findings presented. Now that is not, it's not a strict rule, but it's quite a helpful rule to get you to chunk up what you are going to cover in your findings or results chapters. So Helen, did you only have one result? You had one mega results chapter in the end?
I had a findings chapter which was separated into the 3 superordinate themes. So it should, some people would have separated into 3 separate chapters, but because of the way the IPA works, particularly, I wanted it to be read like one story. So not that the examiners may, spent much time, one of them did, on it, but that was something which I felt that was the way I wanted it to be read.
But there was still a rule of 3.
There was a rule of 3.
Yeah. Superordinates, and I have 3 big chapters. I have the call center, the HR professionals, and the learning and development team. And it's quite helpful to think in those terms. And I would say that if you get to more than 3 big chunks of findings, you're at real risk of losing depth. It's quite a lot to cover more than 3 big chunks in a thesis. So subsequently, I've said, and I tend to work in rules of 3 in my academic papers. I do work in rules of 3 in the academic papers. I always have 3 contributions, and I always have 3 sections in my data presentations, nearly always. Interestingly, I have discovered on looking at it today that actually I only have 2 sections in each of my chapters, which is interesting. I think maybe they've all got different ones, which would be a terrible sin to have committed.
Whereas I had 3 superordinate themes, each with 3 sub-themes.
Yeah, that's because I knew it was 2.
So
they all have 2. But where my data chapters are all about a different group, the structure of each chapter is identical. So I have told the same story because I'm answering the same research questions in each chapter about a different group. So you are always trying to tell this story rather than present it in a sort of, here's everything I found out sort of way. And because your examiner is not always reading everything from start to finish, I put a little bit of an introduction in each of my chapters that reminded them what I was doing and where I was. Signposting at this stage is absolutely critical. Quite frankly, reading other people's research findings in the length that they are in a thesis can be incredibly dull. Sorry. It's really hard work for the examiners because you sometimes forget who the people are that they're talking to or what the organization is like. You have to do a lot of flicking backwards and forwards in a thesis to try and remember why people are doing things. So the easier you make this bit for your examiners, the better. Helen did a great job of that because in her Viva, which I was allowed to sit in but not say anything in, we got all the way through the theoretical framework and I'm like, right, here we go. And then they moved on to the discussion. I didn't even ask her any questions about
the bit I spent most time on. And pretty much, I would say about 40% of my PhD time was spent on my findings and it wasn't discussed in my Viva. So I was quite pissed off, quite frankly.
Would that be because it was corporate?
Yes. Yes. If your examiners are happy with something, they're not going to spend any time on it, very little time on it anyway. They spend the time. I mean, we try not to make them hours and hours and hours these days. They spend the time on the stuff that they need to confirm So yes, that was a good thing.
But still pissed me right off.
I thought I'd missed something. I was like, well, I couldn't say anything, so it was very weird. But they will often ask you questions because it's quite a as an examiner, you are signing off that you are confident that the person has actually conducted the research, and so asking you are satisfied that they did the research themselves. So asking some questions about an interview experience or something in your analysis is usually a good way to make sure that you can actually tick that box. Ensure you present your analysis, although not just your data. This is something that you will come to as you go through. So it's perhaps, if you're at the early stages, not to worry too much about, but this is not, that's an interesting thing about participant voice in theses, because you are generally trying to present your analysis, not what your participants said. And there is a subtle but important difference. It is not about cramming this full of illustrative quotes if you've got textual data, or lots of visuals if you've got visual data. It is about presenting your analysis of the data with enough data to evidence that analysis. So I would think about it as analysis first and data second. Again, I had big table, making sure I'd got quotes from enough sources, making sure I was doing that. But when I was editing down my findings chapter, the things that often went were extracts rather than analytic work. Now I'm doing discourse analysis, so I have huge chunks, some of which are half a page, some of which are longer. I mean, you know, that one's 6 people talking in a meeting and it's 2/3 of a page. I've got long extracts and a lot of analysis, but there's no way there's 90 encounters in that in that thesis. It's just not. It's much more saying, here's a really detailed example analysing what I'm claiming about the discursive construction of knowledge. It's not about filling the thesis with lots and lots of quotes. I still find that, again, next to I tend to be the methods and methodology person when I review something, is I'm quite often saying, you're asking the reader to do the analysis. You're just giving them data. They don't want to see data, but what I actually want to know is, what's your analysis? Because that is what gives you your hook to your contribution. You can't get from data extract to contribution. There's a huge yawning gap in between those. It's your analysis that lets you build your contribution, not your data. So it is about balance, and that's something that you really can't tell until you're getting to the editing stage of your chapters, and you're generally having a look about saying, is there, so I've got 3 chapters. I was making sure that there was an even balance across the 3 chapters. They would say with your themes, have we got the same amount of data? I do remember we counted the number of extracts, and have we got enough data, but more importantly, have we got enough analysis? Does that make sense? Simon, do you have a question?
I do, if that's okay. With your analysis chapters, the 3 that you talk about, are you at this stage introducing references back to the literature?
No.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you thought it was good. I do not want to see any literature. We've done it occasionally. Yeah. There is the odd time I've done it. I've done it recently a couple of times in visual analysis. That's not the play. This is your presentation of your analysis. You're not trying to link it to the literature here. I know some people do it. I get to review papers a lot that have done it. But interestingly, I've just been working on a review of quite a tricky paper with work, employment and society, and all three reviewers have pushed back on saying this isn't where you pull the literature in. We need to we need to see your data and your analysis, and your literature should be in your literature review and your discussion.
And this is where using thematic analysis and where people misuse thematic analysis, because there is a suggestion. So way back in 2006, when Braun and Clark first initially published some stuff on thematic analysis, there was an interpretation that in the analysis of qualitative work that you brought in, you could bring in theoretical stuff and theoretical stuff to help your analysis. Now, they have now moved away from that, and there has been some misinterpretations of it.
But that was largely to distinguish from grounded theory, which when the argument was you don't hold any theory even in your head when you go and do data collections. What they were saying is it's fine to have a theoretical grounding as you do your analysis. They didn't mean put the literature in your
and that's been a misrepresentation. And so you do see a lot of people who just bring in, and it's almost like they're doing the discussion before they've done the analysis.
No,
so
because I try and stress that it is perfectly possible in a qualitative piece of work to show how the data is interesting and important in that of itself.
Yeah, you're answering your research questions there. You're not connecting yet.
In IPA, if there was any type of literature being referred to, and that would be, you would not,
because you're situating yourself in the participant's experiential frame of reference, and that is all you're doing in IPA.
You can use it, for example, when if you're using the word stereotype is part, and you're trying to, say the participants talking stereotypes, to clarify what you mean by stereotype, you might refer to Green's paper on stereotypes to just clarify that's how you're analysing, interpreting what a stereotype is. That's then when stereotyping isn't a key concept in your absolutely
in your
it's more just a
doing
clarification
it for
of interpretation.
So I've done it in visual analysis. I've done it when I am I've done it to reference visual theory on a particular aspect of the image, that I've done it to reference how hands are used, for example, in visual imagery, in visual theory, just as a short explanation, because that's all it needs. It's not a big part of the paper. It just needs acknowledgement that I'm making that connection. But yeah, no, that's a good point. We probably add that to the slide.
Really,
so this is really setting up the answer to your research questions. Also why having 71 research questions was not a good idea.
Can I just make a point on the balance of quotes?
Yes, do.
One thing which you need to just think about when you're including when you're kind of trying to find the balance, what you also have to remember, and particularly within kind of some of the more kind of phenomenologically in-depth stuff, is it tends to be good practice to include quotes which you don't decontextualize quotes or take them out of context, or you don't because what you can tend to do is cause what we call overinterpretation. You're taking stuff away from the participants' own meaning making and sense making, if you're calling it that. And so it's important, and that comes with the kind of the editing phases of when you're doing your findings, is making sure that balance is considered throughout, and you're not taking stuff out of context just to achieve a theme or achieve something which is a bit, you want to make something interesting. It's either it's there in your data and the participants have said it, or it isn't. You can't just take it out of context and make it something that it's not. And that comes from achieving that balance. You can use some one-line quotes if you want to, but ultimately there needs to be a balance of, there's also needs to be some of those slightly longer contextualized quotes as well. And achieving that balance throughout your findings is key. I'm done with that. Any questions?
I thought you were also going to say, I mean, we will do a whole nother thing on writing up results, but if you were there I would expect to see you somewhere in your analysis presentation. So I would expect to see some sort of exchange. So I made sure that in each of my chapter there was something where my voice was there as well.
Yeah.
So I was asking a question. I can't find an example.
One of the ways you could do that, or particularly tricky interview encounters, or when a participant may have reacted, talking about that and how that, you know, you can talk about some of those interactions and put that in your analysis, because that has an impact on how that data is interpreted by you as a researcher. So, you know, so-and-so was quite frustrated when I asked them this question, and you provide, you know, and then so it provides a bit more, and, you know, again, it reminds the person reading it, I was there, I was doing the interview, I'm analysing this data, I'm an analytic tool.
And I've got extracts from field notes in mine as well that I took as I went along. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, the idea was that this was a walkthrough. It's an overview. We're not trying to, I mean, even in the time we've got, we're not going to get into the detailed nitty-gritty of how you do each bit. So I'll move on to the tricky bit, discussion. So before I do that, I have three separate chapters, and for a long time I had what was called chapter 9.5, which became chapter 10, which I wrote in the 4 days before I submit my thesis. Not a good plan, but I found that I didn't have enough room in my discussion to pull together my 3 chapters. It was getting too distracting. So I have a chapter called Discursive Themes. Pretty good they are, themes, but there are bits of this chapter that I really, really, really don't like. There's some diagrams about how the different chapters compared that aren't great. But there were quite strong claims in here about the themes, and they enabled me to bridge to the contribution. So you've got to scaffold this. You've got to take your examiners right the way to your contribution. You've really got to lead them there. So they know where they're going, and they know that you've taken them there. A jump to suddenly some claim in the discussion, I think, is my biggest problem when I get to a discussion. So at some point, you need to summarize your analysis, but that is not what the main purpose of the discussion is. The main purpose is to reflect and review, come back to what you set out to do, review your research questions, and then, with appropriate amendment by Helen this morning, contribution is queen. This ties back directly to the requirements of PhD, DBAs, advanced research degrees set by universities. This is what everybody is looking for. And there are 4 types of contribution, I would say. I mean, probably more, but 4 types that are possible, one of which you absolutely must nail. The first is the empirical contribution, and that is usually that you've looked at something in a place or in a way that someone hasn't looked at before. So you've done research. I did research on HR professionals in banking. Actually, there were lots of different empirical contributions, but and nobody had done that before, right? They might have looked at HR professionals in higher education, but it's an empirical contribution of some sort. I've done something different from somebody else, done it in a different place usually, or with a different group of people, or with a slightly different framing, or a slightly different. It's usually necessary to have an empirical contribution to get to your conceptual theoretical contribution, but not always. So it's usually necessary, but never sufficient. It's never enough. This is different for a master's thesis. It's never enough in an advanced degree to have just done some research in a different place or with a different group of people. That's really not likely to be enough. So empirical contribution is the first type. The second type is contribution to practice. Different degrees place different emphasis on that. A DBA places more emphasis on that than a PhD, although it's now common with our broad, we've all had impact stamped across our foreheads in academia. So it's now more common to find that in a PhD than it certainly was when I did mine. And again, it has to be clear and specific. It can't just be a generic, oh, things are going to be better now type claim. It has to be really focused on policy, practice, something very specific. The meat in your discussion is your theoretical or conceptual, whichever term you want to use, contribution. And this is where you are extending, developing the work that you've set out in your literature review. What do we know now that we didn't previously, conceptually and theoretically, about something? It's the thing that people get most anxious about because of those words like significant in the regs. But you're not, well, one of you might be the Marie Curie of the management world. I'm sorry for not having more faith. But most of us are not the Marie Curie of the management world. Most of us are not going to make groundbreaking, life-changing, hugely significant discoveries in our PhDs. What we are going to do is nudge things in a particular direction, develop a particular frame of thinking, change the way in which a theoretical element might be considered. So we are generally looking here about, people talk about step change, incremental additions to conceptual and theoretical ideas, not being the new Carl Weick or or Foucault or Bordeaux or whoever you want to pick out of a hat. We're not trying to say that a thesis has to do that, but it has to do something, and that you must have taken the examiners there every step of the way. Sometimes you read a thesis and you get to the discussion and you go, I have no idea how we ended up here, because people panic and they suddenly write some claim that they have developed a new model for something or other, and you haven't seen that one coming. It's just hit you on page 182, and you have to go back and read the whole thing again to try and work out if they actually have done that. People love to present a new model, which is not my favorite type of conceptual or theoretical contribution. Methodological contribution is a bonus. I happen to think it's quite important, but it's generally a bonus. Examiners will not normally go looking for a methodological contribution unless you're me. And I go looking for methodological competence, but I always think it's nice to be able to have a contribution. Helen's thesis was the first time that they had used that Lego, that had been used, that material methods had been used in an interpretive phenomenological framework. Had done, in fact, I'd supervised another PhD that had used imagery. Images had been used, but not Lego. So that was really cool. I had a particular take on the combination of ethnography and discourse analysis, which I subsequently wrote up and did a bit of exploration about qual as a mixed method. So you probably other people, in fact, nearly everyone I've supervised has ended up with some form of methodological contribution. So it's always possible. And the other thing you're trying to do in your discussion is tying up any loose ends, things that you perhaps didn't quite get to, and heading examiners off at the pass, which is my favorite expression. So at some point in the discussion, you'll set out what you're going to do next. This is the point that you can wrap in, like Helen gave the example about liminality, and I had something on gender. You know, these were possible things I could have looked at in my PhD. In my future research, I'm planning to, you know, so you've sort of dealt with that. And then there's usually a sort of section on limitations, a section on, you know, various, I mean, the different, I mean, these are the main things. Different people have put things in different places. Sometimes there's more reflexivity in a discussion than there is at other stages. But that's the last chapter. So we have, I don't know what we've got on the next slide. Oh, some general top tips. So do plan out your chapters and tackle them one at a time. I mean, don't, you know, you can have multiple things on a go, but you want to work on a chapter by chapter basis. But a thesis is more than a set of individual chapters. Every time, every single student I've supervised has got to their last year and I've said, give me a plan. And they've gone, I'm writing this chapter, then this chapter, then this chapter, then this chapter, then this chapter, and I'm submitting. And I go, no, it doesn't quite work like that. Once you've written all the chapters, then you have to pull them together in a thesis. So those connections and signposts, my thesis has a lot, as does Helen's, of mini summaries at the end of chapters that are very clear. In this chapter, I have X, Y, Z. In the next chapter, I'm going to A, B, C.
I wrote my summaries so that if you only read the summaries of the entire thesis, you'd be able to understand what it was about without reading it. So I wrote them on the assumption that the examiners would only read the chapter summaries.
They didn't. One of them definitely read the whole thing. Yeah, so write them last. It's really difficult because at some stage you want to do all those hooks and all those connective points. But if you start it too early, you're having to constantly redo them as you rewrite stuff. So, you know, your constant C section 3.5.3 then has to become C section 3.8.6 or 4 points, and you're just spending ages and ages. One of our current PhD students, I don't know if she's called Louisa, puts the word elephant in her chapters to know that she's got to come back and put a connection in it, because she can just search for the word. So, which I think is quite clever. Right? It's good. I just had square brackets in mine, which wasn't as interesting. So at some stage you need to put in all those links, and it's a fine balance between doing it too early and too late. You don't want to be frantically doing it the week before you submit. As Helen said, chapter summaries are really useful. They also help you be sure how you will explain something in a Viva. Practicing reading them out loud is quite useful.
It also helps with writing your introduction, which is should be the last thing that you write, really. So once you've got an idea of
the introduction.
Yeah, and it's really it's the last thing that I wrote, because it's once you've got the hook and you understand what your thesis is doing, which you won't do until the end, you can't really explain to the people your introduction is all about explaining this is what it's about. So I think it's it's the place to end with, confusingly.
We've said several times the thesis isn't a textbook, but it's also not a mystery tour. It's not it's not, oh, did they, didn't they, is there a happy ending, who killed, it's not an Agatha Christie novel. I don't want any surprises. I want to see it all laid out and be able to follow it really clearly. I don't want to be treated like an idiot, but nor do I want to be treated like an insider who knows what's going on in your brain. I need to be taken through it, particularly because you never, ever read a thesis start to finish. And whenever I've read a thesis, honest admission, it's usually at the end of the day or on a train, or sometimes, in another meeting, or, I will always clear out a day before a Viva or a day before the report is due to make sure that I have got everything straight. But that first read through, you're doing it as and when, because it's, it's a beast. You're not going to sit down and read it straight forward. So do make it easy for them, and allow time at the end for all the admin stuff. There's a lot of admin. We called Sarah Warren queen of PhD admin the other day. I mean, you know, there are forms to fill in. You got to make sure that it's formatted correctly. And I used EndNote during my thesis, and at one stage my reference list suddenly became 175 pages because something weird happened in EndNote, and I had to pull all the field codes out of the entire thesis and do all the referencing manually. So that was a fun thing to happen a month before I submitted. So just be careful that you've got time for all that sort of logistical thing. I mean, now it's much easier. I had to physically take this beast in and hand it in, and someone had to leaf through it and check it. At least now we're still in this post-COVID submit via PDF online, which didn't exist before the pandemic.
I think it's that it's also managing yourself through that process, because it is incredibly tiring. And I think particularly if you're doing it part-time and if you're doing it in addition to a full-time job, it's the recognition of just how tiring it is. And when you get to the point of, you know, you get to the discussion and it's an end, it does feel like you're at an end point. But it's just recognizing that is also when you're probably most tired. And that's where, you know, you need to give yourself the space and time to do the admin and etc. And I submitted my thesis with the wrong reference list. You know, I was knackered, completely knackered. I was doing a paper alongside it. I was just gone then at that point. And it was a huge error. It was an easy error to fix, a frustrating one, but to get done all of that time and written all of that work just for that oversight was just an annoyance. So it's just worth giving yourself the time and space and recognize that you will be knackered in those stages.
Although I still reckon, I mean, I have had other very productive phases, but it's probably, I still think of those days somewhat wistfully about how effectively my writing worked towards the end, because it was largely what was taking up my brain space. And I had my own company. I had 2 young children, got a puppy. Don't do that. I was doing sessional lecturing, and yet somehow I managed to write a thesis. And then I look back and you go, well, that was quite good. It was still the most effective writing. I've had a few other spells. We had a manic revise and resubmit schedule last year where we submitted 3 papers in 3 weeks. That was pretty good. That was close.
Those were the days.
But you will get there. You will suddenly find that you are very, very productive. And the deadline is, you know, I was ESRC funded, you were funded by the university. So I had a deadline. I had to submit by a date. And at that point, that really that does focus the mind somewhat. If you don't have that sort of deadline, then it's not quite the same.
I'll just put 2 other things to the discussion also for your thesis broadly, is make sure research questions are reflected throughout your thesis. So I think I pretty much put my research questions in every chapter, bar my literature review, because that is leading up to them. So ensure they're reflected throughout your thesis. That also helps you keep on track. And really think about, with your discussion, making sure that there is a clear link back to your literature review. And that's where I wrote my discussion and my lit review at the same time, to make sure that I was connecting back to the literature. And that's a really good marker of a good discussion, is that you're clearly connecting back to literature that you highlighted in your literature review as area, you know, as a particular body which needs this or critiques that, and you're showing what your findings and where your findings sit within it. And that's just those kind of clear markers. And it's almost like you have your literature review up on one screen or half your screen and your discussion on the other, and you're just checking where.
And that is where a supervisor earns their money. You know, a good supervisor is worth their weight in gold, because a good supervisor will go through and actually say, look, you've got 3 pages in this literature review. You don't come back to them ever again. Do you need to come back to them? And if not, should we have these 3 pages? If they're context, then we need to clearly say this is here because it's context. Because an examiner is going to say, you spent this time setting up this particular concept, but you don't ever come back to it. And it's that reading across that a good supervisor will do with you at the end. Helen got fed up with my track change comments.
Oh, so annoying. So many comments.
Generally right.
Yeah, always right, which is why it was annoying. But I think that's the other thing is that when you've completed your first, when you've done your draft, you've done your writing, and particularly with, I think with findings, it's hard because it's so much of it, particularly with qualitative work, is up here and all the workings are up here. And it can be that frustrating. And because also the addition of COVID, we didn't
we didn't have face-to-face meetings. So there was a lot more document exchange than there would have otherwise been.
Absolutely, there was a lot, but those kind of conversations with your supervisors are really key when you're, particularly in your findings, when you just want to work stuff out. And we didn't have a lot of that. But that made me write better because I had to communicate what I wanted in my findings better. So it's about, and you part of the thing about doing your findings chapter, which we didn't mention, was you will rewrite your findings chapter probably more than any other chapter, because part of your analytic process
happens through the
is writing. So that is part of it. And that was for me the hardest, that was the longest chapter. I think I kept that chapter longest before I let Katrina see it, because I just didn't.
But don't do that. Always give your examiners, your supervisors stuff.
I didn't let her near it.
It's much better to chuck it over the fence and see what comes back than think you've got to craft it personally before you show it perfectly before you show it to anyone else.
Can I make an observation then, Helen, from my own experience, if that's okay?
Yeah. I think we're going to open it up to questions now anyway.
Right.
We're at the end of this.
Very quickly, I think I totally agree with Katrina, because my thesis would have taken a very different turn if I hadn't given my supervisor sight of my early analysis, because he actually said there's something interesting going on here. Here's some stuff you need to read, and he took me down an entirely different direction and actually introduced me to the notion of economic rationality, which just opened up an entire different avenue and became in fact the main contribution of my thesis.
Yeah, the same happened with me. It was and I think we would write a paper on some of my findings, and we discussed around this thing around neoliberalism and the entrepreneurial self, and that became one of my that completely opened me up to, and I had to then put it a whole section of my lit review on it.
Trusty supervisor.
Yeah, well, I think it's proof of the pudding. I'm still writing with mine, although I've just published probably the last work in progress of my own PhD supervisor, which is how many years after I finished my PhD? I mean, a lot, obviously. 2007 to 2023. And Helen and I are still working together, and the Breaking Barriers research is not what was in your thesis. It's a completely new research project. And if you're thinking of an academic career, that's where you want to end up. You want to end up working with your supervisor. You want to end up with a good relationship with your, maybe that's overstating it.
Conducive. Your brains and everyone's brains online are probably completely frazzled because there's so much. But if anyone does have any questions online, then chuck them our way. Also, you guys, you are probably completely all the DBA researchers who have been here all day.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Saturday.
About half a day.
Yeah.
2/3.
Feel free online if you want to unmute yourself and ask any questions.